young people. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about fractions. So I want to focus today on halves and fourths. So I'm starting out with a little model here I have to use for our fractions today. And this is our whole when we're looking at these circular models. And whole, remember, is the one with the W at the beginning, not like a hole in the ground, but more like the whole thing. It means one whole thing with nothing missing from it. So this is the size of our whole, this little circle right here. And I want to talk about halves first. So what do we know about halves? I'm going to first bring over a model of halves right here. There's my model of half, same size as my whole, right? But this one, this brown one, has been cut in half. So how would I write 1/2? I would write a 1 over a 2, right? So this 2, the bottom number in a fraction, is what we call the denominator. That's our technical term in math. We call the denominator is the bottom number, and it is the number that tells us how many parts there are in our whole. So there are 2 parts. And then the top number, or the numerator, is the number that tells us how many of those parts we're talking about. So this right here is 1/2, and this one over here I could call 1/2, right? Okay, now remind me of the other thing that we said about fractions. If I wanted to name these parts with a fraction, what was my rule? My little sentence that I said was my rule for fractions. Fractions are fair. That's right. So when we name a part with a fraction, the parts have to be the exact same size, or else I'm not allowed to name them with a fraction. So we can tell when we look at these 2 parts that they are exactly the same. Here, I'll flip it over and line them up and show you. See how they're exactly the same? So it's fine for me to call these halves. So there's 1/2 and 2 halves. And when I have 2 halves, that makes a what? Yeah, that makes a whole. Good. So whenever you see a fraction with a 2 in the denominator, you know that your whole things have been split into 2 equal parts. They're fair. This part is the same as this part. They are fair and split fairly. So if you were splitting a pie with someone and you got this piece and the other person got this piece, we could say it was fair and that you each got a half, right? And how many halves are there in a whole? 2, that's right. Good. Okay, now I'm going to erase my halves here, and we're going to use the same size whole model, like this blue one, and we're going to look at fourths and talk about them for a second. Okay, so the fourths model from this model kit is yellow. All right, so we've still got that same size whole. Just going to line it up for you so you can see. Same whole, but this time we've divided the whole into how many equal parts? Ooh, that one flipped right up on me. Yeah, into 4 equal parts. So how would I name one of these parts? Well, I'm going to draw my line because I know I'm writing a fraction. How many equal parts are there in the whole thing? 4. Good. And how many am I looking at right here? 1. So we call this fraction 1/4 with a TH. Good. 1/4. And I wanted to tell you something else about fourths today, because we have another word that we use for 1/4. We also use the term 1/4. 1/4. Interesting. So that's another word we use when we have a 4 in the denominator. We call it 1/4. Now, you might have heard that word quarter before. It might remind you of the Spanish word for 4. Uno, dos, tres, cuatros. Yeah, 4. So 1/4 is the same as 1/4. It's just another name for 1/4. So how many fourths or quarters do we have in one whole thing? That's right, 4. So I'm going to name these other parts. So I've got 1/4 and 1/4 and 1/4 and 1/4. So I have 4 fourths, and we know I could also call them quarters, so let's call them that now. 4 quarters, and that equals 1 whole. I'm going to write a big number 1 right down here next to the word whole. So 4 quarters equals 1 whole. Does that remind you of anything else you know about? Yeah, of course it does. That's exactly why we call those 25-cent coins that we have, that's why we call them quarters. Because a quarter plus a quarter plus a quarter plus a quarter equals 1 whole dollar. That's exactly right. Yeah, so a quarter is 1/4 of a dollar. Good thinking. Okay, so if I were going to change my, I don't need to change it exactly, but I could add to my title up here. We're talking about halves and fourths, and I can also put the word quarters right above. So quarters or fourths are the same thing. So halves and quarters. All right, now I'm going to show you a different model just so you can think about these halves and quarters. I'm going to show you a different whole. Look at that. It's got a little number 1 written on it. That is 1 whole. It's a model of 1 whole. And now, watch this. What does that one say? 1/2. So how many halves will equal this 1 whole? Yes, 2. So I'm going to squeeze those together so they're all clipped. And look at that. A half and a half makes 1 whole. And you're thinking to yourself, Mrs. Bennett, I totally already knew that. I know that if I have a cookie and I give half to my sister and I have half, then we've eaten the whole cookie, right? Well, of course you do. Well, that's the fun thing about math. You use math all the time, every day, and you don't even realize it. That's why you guys are mathematicians, because you use math all the time without even realizing. Okay, so there's 2 halves in this 1 whole. And now I'm going to get out the model for fourths. So I've got 1/4 or 1/4. How many am I going to have all together to make 1 whole? Yeah, I'm going to have 4 of them. So there's another one. I'm going to click those together. There's another one. Click those together. And another one. Click those together. So there we have it. 1, 2, 3, 4 fourths are the same as 1 whole. Notice anything else? Yeah, when you're watching me put these together, you might have noticed some things. You might have noticed that 2 of these fourths are exactly the same as a half. Yeah. And you might have noticed that 1, 2, 3, 4 fourths is the same as 1, 2 halves and also 1 whole. Yeah. So you've discovered all kinds of things playing around with halves and fourths today. So now I'm going to ask you one more question before I let you go. Okay? I'm going to show you. That's one of our fourths. And that's one of our halves. Which one is bigger? Yeah, the half is bigger. But look at those denominators. This denominator is a 2, and that denominator is a 4. That seems kind of weird, right? Because I know that 2 is a littler number than 4, so why would 1/2 be bigger than 1/4? Well, it all gets back to what fractions are all about. Because that bottom number, that denominator, tells us how many parts there are in the whole. And so when I see 1/2, I know there are only 2 parts. That means that if this was a delicious, luscious brownie and you were splitting it into 2 pieces, then you would get this size piece and your friend would get that size piece. Pretty yummy and pretty big, right? But if this was another delicious brownie and you had to share it with your whole family, so your mom got that piece and you got that piece, your sister got that piece, and Uncle Bubba got that piece. Are you getting as much brownie as you got when you split it with just one person? No, your piece is smaller. So the more pieces you make of your whole, the more equal pieces there are, the smaller the pieces get. Because the whole thing is the same. There's our whole. Okay, so before I leave you, I want you to think about something. So I'm going to draw a pizza here. Let me put some toppings on there. I don't know what kind of toppings those are. Not very delicious looking, are they? Okay, so there's our pizza. And now, here's my question I want to pose to you. And this is going to seem obvious, but I want you to look at the way we write the fraction, and I want you to think about how we name the fraction. So, would you rather share that pizza with just your Uncle Bubba, so that's you and Uncle Bubba sharing the pizza, or share the pizza with your mom, your dad, and your brother? So there are 4 of you sharing the pizza. So you, your mom, your dad, and your brother, you would each get 1/4 for each person. I'm going to put mom, dad, brother. And over here, it's just you and Uncle Bubba. Uncle Bubba. Okay, so would you rather share it with your mom, your dad, and your brother? Let's show you how much you would get. So that's what you would get. That much of the pizza if you were sharing with your mom, your dad, and your brother. If it's just you and Uncle Bubba, you would get this whole thing. This whole hunk, right? Because that's 1/2. So the larger the denominator, the smaller the piece. So that's a big denominator. So that means more pieces, and the pieces are smaller. And this is a smaller denominator. So it's fewer pieces, just one piece, two pieces, and the pieces are bigger. So that's something that you want to understand about fractions, and then when we write and look at fractions. Just like we looked at before, a half is bigger than a fourth, even though the whole is the same. Half is bigger than a fourth. Okay, good work today. Good thinking. So get out there and play around some with some fractions. Think about halves and quarters. Okay, see you next time.